Hello, and welcome to today's event on AI, jobs, and the Global South. My name is Jillian Diebold, and I'm a policy analyst at the Center for Data Innovation, which is a think tank focused on the intersection of data, technology, and public policy. We're here today to discuss some of the big questions in the digital development sphere, namely the impact of trade in digital services has had in the Global South and how the growth of artificial intelligence might impact these trends. We know that the internet has created many opportunities for the Global South to increase trade in digital services, especially through the creation of digital services jobs like content moderation or basic coding, transcription, translation, graphic design. But as we see the AI economy continue to grow, those same digital service jobs are likely to be impacted by AI enabled tools. So today, I'm hoping that we can kind of dive into how countries should respond to these changes. To help answer these questions, we have a really great lineup of panelists. First, we have Mohammed Abdelkader, Chief Innovation Officer and Executive Director for the Innovation, Technology, and Research Hub at USAID, whose office works to apply new innovations and technologies to the development space. Next, we have Kay McGowan, Senior Director of Research, Policy, and Advocacy at the Digital Impact Alliance. And lastly, we have Jonathan Murray, President and CTO of Digital Prism Advisors, who has extensive experience in global digital transformation. I'm hoping that today will be an open discussion. So for those watching online, you can submit and vote on questions using Slido. If you're watching on our website or on one of our other streaming platforms, you can find that link below the video. So to start us off, I think that we should do some level setting. So Mohammed, I think it might be interesting to kind of hear about how USAID approaches digital development and whether you think, this approach should change or how it should change in response to AI.
Thanks so much, Jillian, and thanks for having us today, and nice to be with you and the other esteemed panelists. So USAID approaches digital development. I would say we sort of start with our values, right? Our approach to digital development is centered around engagement with a safe, secure, and inclusive digital environment. That's really where we start. So I often like to say it's important to start with our values. USAID has been tracking and investing in artificial intelligence and trying to understand both its promise and the dangers of AI for international development for several years. So this isn't a new thing for us. The recent surge in the attention to AI with tools like ChatGPT coming on the scene has really meant that artificial intelligence continues to be an important part of our work. Throughout the years, our approach has been not just to promote the use of AI, but to invest in responsible AI, which I think is an important distinction. And this is because we understand that AI poses unique challenges and risks and potential harm, really, to those who are vulnerable if it's not deployed responsibly. We've released a number of research and guidance documents to explore what responsible artificial intelligence means for international development, including a foundational report that we released recently called "Making AI Work for International Development." You should check it out on our website, as well as a USAID artificial intelligence action plan last year. And that action plan puts forward a roadmap for how the agency can shape AI development towards really better outcomes for developing countries. As you know, USAID works in low and middle income countries. And it outlines really what responsible AI means for our agency and the three priority areas for USAID that allow for responsible, effective, and really right-respecting use of AI. Both in our own programming as well as in the ecosystems of our partner countries. And we sort of come back to this question of why does USAID lead with a responsible AI stance? Ultimately, it's because we've seen time and time again how AI developed in one context doesn't necessarily translate well to another context. But in other words, artificial intelligence is not a technology that can always be easily exported. Sometimes we think that it can be, and it sounds simple, but it happens all the time. For instance, like an AI built to make predictions about health outcomes, say in like South Carolina, where I grew up, or Texas, or another state, isn't necessarily going to work in West Africa, right? An AI built in West Africa isn't going to necessarily work in East Africa. the context of AI development is different. That data that feeds into it, the people who are building it, the norms surrounding it, they all play a critical role in how it operates. So if these contextual factors aren't considered, AI can really entrench and scale existing, basically offline inequality or biases into the online space, leading in some cases to exclusion or harm. So I'll pause there.
I think that's really helpful. Kay or Jonathan, do you want to kind of give your own understanding of digital development, or your organization, or your own personal kind of philosophy or approach? Maybe Kay.
I would let Kay go, and then I've got some thoughts on what Mohammed just touched on in terms of the context.
Yeah, same. So first of all, Jillian, thank you so much to you and your colleagues at the Center for Data Innovation for putting this together and inviting me to join this conversation. It's obviously incredibly timely. I don't think any of us can go 5 or 10 minutes these days without seeing a headline or hearing somebody mention AI. Just in the past few months, it's become this incredible phenomenon, which is, I tend to think, a little bit overhyped at the moment, but maybe we can get into that conversation a little bit later. But yes, I work at the Digital Impact Alliance, and our mission is really to ensure that digital technology is benefiting everybody everywhere. And, you know, for many, many years, that focus really was grounded on closing the digital divide. And I think what's so interesting now is we really start to see at least the broad contours of the AI future come into focus, is that it's made more clear than ever, and this goes back to what Mohammed was just saying, that we need not only to worry about the digital divide, but the data divide, right? Because who is producing data? Who is having data produced about them, how that data is being used, or in many cases in the Global South, not used, to be able to help contextualize, tailor services to make them both relevant, but also safe, is just an incredibly pressing issue. And I would say that my kind of existential worry right now about AI is that we're still a good decade or two away from meaningfully closing the digital divide. And at the pace that AI is moving, without closing that digital divide, and at the same time thinking very deliberately about how to ensure people get more value from and exercise more rights over the data that they're producing online, we are really going to be exacerbating existing problems and creating new problems that are really difficult to even foresee at the moment. Let me hand it over to Jonathan.
Please.
I agree largely with, and again, Jillian, thank you to you and the team for hosting this. Is a really important discussion. I agree with much of what Mohammed and Kay just outlined. I think I've got two problems with, and I agree with Jillian on the hype that we have today. We just come off a decade of 5G being hyped as the next revolutionary thing that was going to transform the entire world. And it didn't, right? So I'm really quite cautious about the fact that we're now on a hype cycle around AI, which we can get into some definitional discussions, in my view, is mislabeled, right? None of these systems are actually intelligent. These systems are essentially the sum product of the data that goes into them. And so the point that both Mohammed and Kay have made, if it's not your data, then these tools are not necessarily very helpful to you. So the context of the data and the source of the data, all of these systems are doing are just in a very smart way, and it looks intelligent to us, actually giving us a way to sample into that data, get smart results from a data set that the tools have been trained on. And if you're not training on your data, you're using somebody else's training data, and that has major risks in terms of context and bias, as Mohammed pointed out, and not using local data as a source is a real problem. The other problem is that, and this is the hype side of things, is, at least in my experience, politicians, policymakers that I've worked with quite often have what I call a shiny object syndrome, which is the next big thing is the thing that everybody focuses on. to the distraction of everything else. To, you know, the thing that was important is no longer important because this is the big thing. And I think Kay's point about the digital divide and making sure that we close the digital divide, and I love the term the data divide as well, and not lose sight of having to do those basics while we're focused on a potentially powerful technology and its impact on society and our jobs and what have you, which we'll get into, is really important. And I think helping advise policymakers not to just switch perspective from one set of technologies and problems to this brand new thing that everybody's super excited about, I think is critically important, because we won't, if you don't close those gaps that we've all been working on for 10, 20, 30 years, then the AI will not fulfill its promise, even as it develops as a technology. So I think those things are critically important.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, just from that, there's a couple themes that are already kind of coming out, you know, the importance of inclusivity here, right? And that means both in the technology and the use and the data itself. I mean, I've personally done a lot of research on the data divide, so it's something near and dear to me. But I think that, you know, those are some really good guiding points for us, thinking about the inclusivity angle, think about the context, and then thinking about, you know, whether this is just, you know, like you said, Jonathan, just part of the hype cycle. And I tend to agree as well that, you know, the center has done some work on the panic cycle of technology in general. And, you know, we are reaching that kind of peak right now. And at the same time, I don't think this technology is going away. So it is really important that we are talking about that. I think building off that, it would be really interesting, kind of, maybe Kay can start us off by talking about, you know, what kind of policies are needed, both from, you know, the global north side and you know, development agencies and in the global south countries themselves, to get AI right. You know, maybe what are some of those policies that might really help ensure that these AI driven services are benefiting everyone and kind of getting that inclusive factor.
Yeah, let me just go back to what Jonathan was just saying to underscore the point about fundamentals, right? If you're not online and producing data, then there's not even a possibility of AI services being contextualized or helpful to you, much less accessible, right? But I think that when you look beyond the basics and then inclusive training data, as we've already discussed a little bit in this context, you know, there are a few really other foundational pieces, right? And so the Digital Impact Alliance just released a great new paper by one of our advisors on the languages, right? So if we think about training data and you think about the natural language libraries that are feeding into this AI, it really reflects a very small slice of society, right? Which has implications beyond just relevance and accessibility. It also means that, you know, if your training data is mostly based on English, right? Because English is far and away the most dominant language on the internet where this data is being culled from, then you have not just English language and English speaking perspectives kind of dominating, you're actually getting up to kind of who's participating most actively online, right? And so you're getting up into the echelons of economically elite. You're not getting a full spectrum of voices. You know, if we think about the loudest voices on the internet, they don't tend to include, you know, dissent or marginalized voices, or, you know, and so I think that we really risk having a lot of bias built into these systems if we don't very proactively and very deliberately focus on increasing just the natural language processing and the data which is being fed into these systems. And I think we have a few interesting examples going back to your question about government policy, right? So India has this remarkable statistic that it has over 600 million Hindi speakers, and yet Hindi makes up less than 0.1% of content on the internet, right? And putting Hindi aside, you have, you know, 19 other official languages in India and 100 plus that are spoken by more than 1 million people. And so the government of India is now very proactively investing in ensuring that local languages are being translated into ways that can be read by these systems and be, part of the training data sets in order to help with this contextualization question. You have in Estonia doing the same thing, right? Recognizing that a country of 1.3 million, it's never going to have the commercial investment or incentive, and to invest in Estonian language data here. And so they're also putting government policies, government investment behind that. So I think for sure, one way to do this is more intentionally to focus. There's some grassroots efforts in Africa that are really admirable, but they need real support, right? They need public investment if we're at all serious about closing these divides and making AI fair and equitable for all. And frankly, putting aside fairness and equity, just useful, right? Because while I think all of us agree here that there's a lot of hype at the moment around AI, I think we're going to start seeing productivity gains and closing capacity gaps. That potential is there, and it has enormous potential implications for international development. But without these investments, both in ensuring that the training data is representative, I think we'd be really missing the mark. And then second point, just very quickly, is giving people more access to and rights over their data. That's something that's really only happening in a handful of markets now. I think GDPR is trying across the European Union to give people more rights. But in terms of translating those rights into data more portability, right? Being able to kind of speak with your data about which services you believe in. I think you're going to continue as AI becomes more and more important in the digital economy. You're going to continue to have these huge commercial platforms have an incredible amount of power without real policy decisions to try to find solutions that give people more power.
Thanks for that. Mohammed, I'm kind of curious. So Kay mentioned foundational pieces being, inclusive training data, and then also, access to data via data portability and just digital rights more generally. What are the other foundational pieces, in your opinion, to getting AI right, or to kind of cover it?
Yeah, good. Great question. So a couple of things that, Kay's comments really got me thinking about. In a previous life, I oversaw the world languages operation at the U.S. Department of Education. And one of the statistics that I remember thinking about was, we talk about the promotion of world languages. Folks would often say, well, a lot of the world is speaking English. Everyone's learning English. Shouldn't we just forget about world languages and stick with that? And the statistic I recall was that, look, 75% of the world does not speak English. And those who do often have very limited working proficiency. If you couple that particular point with the fact that, so much of the world's scholarship is produced in the global north, whether in North America or Western Europe, what does that look like for the development of LLMs, of large language models, where these artificial intelligence tools are drawing from, right? What does it look like for someone in the Arabic-speaking Middle East, right? In terms of, the ability of a, of an AI to draw from. And what that leads me to the next point is that there is a significant cumulative advantage for those who are already established, right, in the global north. And that divide will continue. So that's sort of the first point. The second point is just sort of to echo my earlier comment around the values. Got to start with our values, because the technology will continue to change and iterate. And I think from a policymaking perspective, start with your values. So we want a safe, secure, and inclusive experience, as a digital experience. I go back to that as sort of the second point. I'd say a little more broadly as I think about policymakers in the global south and kind of their approach and challenge around this. A lot of that is also going to come in the area of skills, of reskilling, upskilling, and that has to be sort of front and center. The reality is, while yes, I think there will be productivity gains as a result of artificial intelligence, there will also be, some disruption in the labor market. And, in some ways we've often thought about disruption happening in a certain like lower skilled part of the economy. Well, artificial intelligence, I think, has the ability to disrupt, really labor in different parts, in accounting, perhaps in the legal profession, in website development, and things that we sort of never thought about. So I would just say that policymakers need to think a little bit more about short-term reskilling as well as long-term upskilling. On the short-term front, I think this looks like standing up things like certification programs that are aligned with local, with local labor needs, partnering with training institutions or innovation hubs that can lead to jobs. That there's a pipeline for folks that may not know how to navigate this world. Like that is very real, and those are very, I think, clear and tangible things that can be done from post-secondary institutions, from companies that are doing training, from various other community groups, and from a policymaker's perspective, you put your money behind that. There's a variety of existing online courses for artificial intelligence that can be readily used for various purposes. On our part, USAID, like, we feel strongly about taking kind of a sustainable approach to AI-related skill development, and that's really grounded in local needs. You've probably heard a little bit about our emphasis on localization. That's aligned with that. So an example of how we can encourage AI skill development that meets those local needs and takes into account that local context. I'd like to highlight one of the projects that our team, in particular our digital team, has been leading, and it's really a fantastic project for policymakers to be engaged in. Recognizing that technologists who build AI tools have an increasingly important role to play in society. We want to make sure that future technologists are trained not just to code, but to like understand the impact their work has on society. So there's an ethical dimension. And as someone who's gone through a kind of a business school, I'm just so glad to see more and more schools thinking about the ethics in the digital world, not just in the physical world. And sort of after the last financial crisis, we were talking about ethics in banking and whatnot. And now, luckily, that same thread is there for the digital world, because that's going to have implications for us. But as I said before, technology doesn't exist in a vacuum. Like, we really want to make sure that technologists have an understanding of the social, political, and cultural contexts that shape how AI can really impact different people in different environments, how it can be a tool for harm just as it can be a tool for good. And that's a shift that requires how we train technologists, and furthermore, how policymakers think about their own education, right? Like, we do have sort of a very significant age gap. Our policymakers, you see that they are often not the folks who are perhaps what you would think of as folks who are programming. There's a very significant age gap. And if you're still having to teach folks who are policymakers how some social media platforms work, there's a responsibility that I think they also have to get up to speed on how artificial intelligence works. This is a revolutionary technology. And while there might be some hype, it is important that there is a basic understanding of what that looks like. So I'll say kind of my final point is, we've partnered with the Mozilla Foundation to launch something called the Responsible Computing Challenge. Or challenges multiple, and they will be in a number of USAID partner countries. We're going to make awards to academic institutions to really rethink their computing curricula and really infuse ethics and social responsibility into the way that technologists are trained. Our technology division in the Mozilla Foundation, off the top of my head, I think we're doing one in Kenya. Their Responsible Computing Challenges, I think, has selected like their first 8 grantees. Each of these grantees are like higher ed institutions who are going to receive $25,000 to reshape, again, how that curricula is taught from a more holistic way. They're thinking about how do you build local communities around human-centered technology and, and create the career pathways for the students to exercise a responsible approach to tech development. So again, we're policymakers sort of involved in this, and I think there's opportunities for local policymakers to also infuse, like I said, ethics and kind of a holistic perspective in how they approach AI.
I definitely agree with the need for the holistic thing. Taking a step back, Jonathan, I'll go to you in a second. I would kind of want to talk now about a point Mohammed made about AI disrupting labor and workers in really all parts of any country's economy. And so, Jonathan, I was kind of hoping you could talk a little bit about, digital services jobs in the Global South and, the impact of AI on those and kind of maybe the types of jobs you expect to be impacted, maybe in the short term versus the long term, and then, how substantial really you think this impact might be.
So I think one of the things is that we don't know, right? So this is a nascent technology. It has a lot of potential. Nobody knows, not even the producers of the tools know what the ultimate impact is going to be, particularly on labor markets and jobs. But I think Mohammed's pointed out, there is a common consensus growing that a lot of the jobs that we think of as fairly, even though they're, to use a term, white collar jobs, so they require an education today, you're employing people who have reasonably skilled jobs, those jobs will yield to automation, and AI as a set of tools that automate certain jobs, website development, as you've said, content development, content moderation, all of those sorts of things, which we've sort of thought as higher level jobs that require, as I said, sort of a more elevated sort of level of skill. There's a real chance that those jobs will be fairly deeply disrupted as we bring these new generation of AI tools to bear. I think one of the things I think about is you're either a tool user or a tool producer, right? And economically, it's the tool producers that generally extract most of the value out of the system, and tool consumers essentially are, the end users of those products. And I think one of the things that's really important from a policy perspective, which I think picks up on a lot of what Mohammed said, is from local policy perspective, we should be creating policies that incentivize entrepreneurs, reskilling, et cetera, to become tool producers. And one of the great things about this new generation of AI tools, just like prior generations of technology, is that they're platforms, right? They aren't just an end product. I go to the web, I log into ChatGPT. There's a whole platform strategy that allows people to build on and build local tools and local capabilities that are maybe founded on these sort of platforms that are developed elsewhere. But if you take training data that is locally contextualized training data, and you're building services on top of these tools that are locally contextualized services, that is probably the most productive strategy. If you're just consuming the tool that's produced elsewhere, that has less local economic value. So policies that incentivize the relevant skill training, development, et cetera, to build a new generation of tools on these new platforms, I think are really important. I think picking up on what Kay said before, continuing the decades-long investment we've had in open data policies is really important, right? Which is the more data you have accessible at a local level, freeing up those data assets that are locked away right now and making them available for training data, et cetera, that's really critically important. So the fuel and the feed that comes into these systems, continuing those policies around open data, making sure that locally important data resources are available for a new generation of skilled individuals to take advantage of us at a local level and build new tools and systems on, I think that's critically important as well.
Definitely. So I'm kind of curious about, anyone can really answer this, just how, so we've talked about, the policies needed, but, let's say I'm a worker in Kenya right now that does content moderation. It's just an example. How prepared would I be to actually adjust to the changes that we're talking about, in the next 3 months, let's say, my company's changing. How do you deal with that really immediate short term? How prepared would you say that type of worker is to kind of remain competitive? And then, we're talking about these big reskilling programs, but what are the on a smaller level, what are some of those skills themselves? Anyone can really answer. Maybe Mohammed can talk.
I think one of the challenges is going to be the pace of change here, right? Which is, our normal cycle is a decadal change in the adoption. It took us over 10 years to, migrate to cloud and, have cloud become an important economic driver of, the utilization of technology and infrastructure. This is going to happen, all the indications are this is going to happen on a much shorter cycle. And to be honest, there's not a good answer to your question, at least in my experience, right? Which is there is no short-term way you can reskill and deal with the dislocation that's going to be created when organizations that have a certain profile of skills that they use in their organization today, pretty much overnight, at least in a short window of time, can basically say, you know what, we've got a new generation of LLM-based tooling that can replace, 1,000 jobs. There's really no short-term solution to that if you're on the receiving end of that change. That's an unfortunate reality, I think, of what we're doing with. And this set of technologies will have a much shorter adoption curve and a much faster evolutionary curve than we've seen in the past, because these systems are essentially self-improving. And that's one of the, I say, scary things that we're going to have to deal with from a policy perspective. We're not going to have the latitude of a long period of time to think about the dislocation and the change of modalities as this technology comes on stream.
Right.
Can I build on what Jonathan said? Oh, sorry, John, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's correct, right? The pace of change is quick. We know that. We sort of know that a wave is coming, but we don't know where it's going to hit or what it's going to consist of. So what I would sort of say is a couple of things from a skill perspective. Yeah, there's the courses and there's the things that you can do online and learning, this skill and that skill. And I would also say, I'll sort of put on my former educator hat that I think in times like this, the world is becoming more ambiguous, right? There is just more ambiguity. So, in many ways, those kind of executive skills, I'm not going to call them soft skills. I hate that term. But those executive skills for anybody really to have the ability to navigate ambiguity, grit, persistence, creativity. In some spaces we call this like an entrepreneurial attitude, the ability to adapt when the world around you shifts and changes, which inevitably it will, as it has in the past. Change is the constant throughout life. Nothing is going to last forever, except for change. So I would say those are the types of skills and mindsets that we need to build in for our young people, and then everyone else in society who's perhaps outside of the classroom. That's sort of one train of thought that was sparked by Jonathan's comments. The other that I would say is we also do need to think about what the social safety net looks like, right? If you're displacing workers as a result of a new technology, okay, fine. Then how are we setting up new structures to en masse, really get people retrained, but then make sure they're supported in the meantime? Whether that's they've had a loss of income, how is that going to impact their healthcare, their housing? These are all, there's a broader sort of ripple effect there. And I think those are things that have to be considered as well.
And Jillian, if I could just build on a couple of points that both Mohammed and Jonathan started here. I think one of the so I couldn't agree more, like there's no easy answer to your question, which is why we all kind of paused, doe-eyed for a moment. But I do think that it's one of the potential ironies here is that AI itself could, if trained correctly, if developed correctly, if used correctly, could be one of the great solutions for reskilling, right? Especially low-skilled workers. And I think that gives even more of an urgency towards ensuring that this data divide is being addressed, and I think there are also a handful of countries that are really investing in foundational digital platforms that are creating data sets that are going to be incredibly important to resilience, right? To economic resilience in particular. So one of the things that we focus on a lot at the Digital Impact Alliance is this ability or this movement that's gaining some traction now to focus on digital public infrastructure, right? So how do you put in place those foundational layers of making sure everybody has an identity, everybody has access to at least a basic payments account, right? So that they can ladder into the formal financial sector. And this has tremendous implications, not only for unlocking the benefits of financial inclusion, but also spurring innovation. And then to Mohammed's last point, we've seen through COVID, this is the way to create an effective, transparent social safety net that's going to help people, around the world cope not only with the shocks that we know are coming from this rapid technological iteration, but climate emergencies, right? Where you're seeing the exact same problem of increasing dislocation and lack of preparation in the most marginalized communities. So again, I think that, a big part of the answer to this problem has to be investing in getting the data and the accessibility of these digital platforms more widely available.
Kay, could you maybe give an example or two of some of the countries that you've seen that are doing that building of the digital public infrastructure?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the one that's getting the most attention these days, and not just because Prime Minister Modi is landing in Washington, I think, as I speak here, but it's India, right? In part because they're really asserting the model of how they have created an interoperability tech stack over the last 10 to 15 years in ways that have radically advanced inclusion. Right. And you're also starting to see a lot of the other payoffs now of having all SMEs be able to not just access a safe, regulated place to save money, but then with their transaction histories being, digitized, you're seeing the rates of flow-based credit to small businesses and to the poor fall exponentially. You're seeing at the same time micro insurance agencies and micro lenders reducing fraud drastically, both because of AI, but also because this data and these transaction histories are available. And, I don't mean to make it sound simple. It's not simple. And there's a lot that you have to build in that goes beyond the technology, in particular to kind of safeguard people. But it's an incredible opportunity and one that we're seeing now. I mentioned India is always held up. Estonia is another example, Singapore. But really, I do think that the COVID emergency has created a new sense of urgency so that you have countries like Philippines adopting this approach. You have Togo as well as Senegal and Rwanda. And so Colombia, Brazil with its instant payment system. I mean, I think you're seeing governments start to realize that not only for domestic economic growth, but also for the ability to lay down that effective social safety net, that this is really an imperative right now.
Thanks. And then I think in general, I'm looking at some questions from the audience too. Which countries, we were talking about who has the digital public infrastructure that kind of has that consent layer and those tech stacks. But I'm kind of curious in general, maybe everyone can kind of give an opinion, but what countries are probably the best positioned to handle the changes that we've been talking about? I know India obviously has some. So would you say it's the ones that already have this kind of, or are on the path to building it? Or are there any other, standout cases for places that might be best positioned to handle these changes in digital services? Jonathan or Mohammed, if you want to start.
Yeah, I can jump in a little bit, and I guess maybe taking a broader approach at this to say, rather than listing specific countries. I mean, Kay mentioned a few. Obviously, USAID has been working closely with Ukraine on their recent DIA app, which was a major success, and several other countries are interested in sort of modeling their own approach after that, which DIA initially grew as I think the initial impetus was as an anti-corruption tool, right, to digitize certain transactions that would eliminate sort of corruption, but has turned into so much more and has turned into a lifeline, I think, for the Ukrainian people. But rather than list countries, like I think I really want to stress how important it is that we understand a digital ecosystem in its totality and the enabling environments that make that can make a country more or less prepared to embrace a digital economy, right? And I think that holistic perspective is important to take this beyond just artificial intelligence. So like at USAID, we do this through like our digital strategy in particular. We have a tool called the DECA, the Digital Ecosystem Country Assessment. And essentially what it is, it's a comprehensive evidence-based approach that we take to conduct these DECAs in order to understand a country's digital landscape in a holistic manner. And so, like, what does access and affordability for digital tools and services look like? Like, who has access and who doesn't? What are the digital divides, within the population? What are the laws on the books that can preserve people's privacy and data protection? To what extent, is government embracing e-government services, right? All of these factor in, like, what are cybersecurity practices looking like in that country? What does the digital economy look like? Are folks wired and plugged in? And do they have the tools to conduct, commerce? Is there, is the e-commerce, sector healthy, and what barriers exist to it, right? So, what do the consumer protections look like? All of these are questions that are important for us to answer and think about this again in a holistic way. So I don't just think about it as just an artificial intelligence thing and what countries are doing best, but like we have to think of it as a broader ecosystem conversation. And there's a question of sort of digital public infrastructure and digital public goods. These are things that hopefully in this ecosystem, folks in one country can learn from another and certainly share ideas to advance, that safe, inclusive, and secure digital experience. And I'd say steps, that a country would take to prepare their workforce is going to be related to that baseline assessment, right? So much of this, we do think about the impact on a workforce and a citizenry more broadly. So we have to establish that baseline. Where are the vulnerabilities? In the same way that you go to a doctor for a checkup and they say, hey, this looks good, but you're kind of limping a little bit and we need to look at your knee, right? So all of these things, I think, are important to look at. And I think depending on the gaps in a country's digital ecosystem, they need to assess what jobs would be needed to fill those gaps, what competencies are needed, sort of from a curricular perspective to make those jobs more relevant, more attractive for young people, things like that. What do the training programs look like? What social supports are needed? I'd also say, what countries can do now is frankly just to take the holistic look at their digital ecosystem and devise their own strategies for workforce development that are going to meet the needs of their constituents.
I think this is not rocket science, but I think there's probably a very straightforward correlation between educational outcomes and a country's readiness to basically both take advantage of these, but also to deal with the dislocation. So I think if you basically ranked, particularly higher education outcomes, I think if you ranked countries on higher education outcomes, I think there'd be a pretty straightforward correlation between that and their ability either presently to be taking advantage of these tools and technologies or their readiness, creating a skilled workforce, creating I mean, one of the things I think we're talking about a set of tools, ChatGPT, Llama, what have you. But I think the next wave of this, we're starting to see it, is that the tools that we don't think of as AI tools, the productivity tools we use, are essentially all going to have AI embedded into them, right? So prior education policies that train us around using office productivity tools or what have you, essentially training you to fill in a spreadsheet and how to use, Google Docs or what have you, is less valuable today because those tools themselves will be AI enabled and will start to do a lot of the rote work, training you how to ask the questions, what questions to ask, and how to interpret the results you get from the tools, those higher level, Mohammed made this point before, those higher level sort of executive skill sets. Those are the investments that need to be made in the next generation of labor that's going to come in, because that's the training you're going to need, because the tools are essentially going to do all the rote work for you.
Can I build on something what Jonathan said? This reminds me of something that we're sort of in an age where I think for a lot of us, depending on how much gray hair we've got, I've got a few whiskers, but we tend to look at younger folks. We look at folks who are fresh out of school. We look at folks who are young ones who are in like high school, and we say like they're digital natives because these kids were born with phones in their hands and devices in their hands. And I think we've got to be careful about that. I think it's a misnomer, because just because someone knows how to navigate, Instagram or TikTok or Facebook or whatever social media platform they're using, doesn't necessarily mean that they have the digital competence that's needed to navigate the world around them, and whether that is understanding how artificial intelligence works, and perhaps answers that they're seeing online, or content could be generated by an AI. And on the flip side, sort of misinformation and disinformation, right? How are we thinking about a new sort of digital media literacy? And I just don't know that we have kept up in our curricular systems, and that's not just a observation of the global South. I think that is a case for the global North as well, where we've seen how disinformation and misinformation have just wreaked havoc, in elections, in public health situations. This is just something I think we need to start paying attention to at all levels. So just an observation there based on Jonathan's comment.
I mean,
I won't dwell on this because I know we've spent a lot of time on this question. You're probably eager to move on, but in addition to everything Jonathan and Mohammed just said, I couldn't agree more. Of course, we need critical thinking skills, right? And people that are media savvy. If I were a policy maker, really in any country, but in particular in the global South right now, and I had the ability to pour money into supporting one new skill, it would be data scientists. Local data scientists who actually understand the local context and are able, because at the end of the day, as Jonathan said, this isn't magic, right? These are mathematical formulas that are being shaped, foundationally, at least by people. And having people that actually represent the communities that these services are being consumed by, I think is going to be absolutely critical to making sure that these systems are not just relevant, but frankly, safe and equitable.
Definitely. I mean, I think we could have a whole event, frankly, on, the AI literacy question and how and what that looks like, and the types of, the different levels of it. Today we've been talking more about the skills itself rather than that kind of general societal understanding. But I thought Mohammed made a really interesting point about, digital native doesn't actually equate to AI literacy or digital literacy at large. And so that's one of those big questions still. I think we can go into some audience questions now. And I think the first one here is, what's the best way to approach politicians and leaders to have a dialogue around AI's impact on digital work and the need for effective plans and policies? I think that's an interesting question, just kind of about, how do we actually bring up this conversation? It's like everyone's having it, but how do we have the right conversation is kind of what I think this question is getting at. Anyone can take it, or I'll call on you.
I think it's an interesting question. That's a tough one. I mean, these questions are already certainly being talked about in policy circles. But I would say back to my earlier point, one, like, what are our shared principles and values here, right? Because there's always going to be differences between, at least certainly in the U.S. context, like right and left. But I think if we start with our again, kind of premise of like a safe, secure, and inclusive internet, digital experience. That's a baseline where I think folks can come together. The other is like, what are the ethics around this, right? We want to make sure people are protected. And then the third piece that I would say is that this really does impact folks from all walks of life. So when you have those conversations, it should be inclusive in nature, right? Think about who's at the table and who is represented. It is important to make sure that you've got sort of gender representation from religious communities, from ethnic communities, from different socioeconomic classes, from different types of work, different sectors, both public and private sector included, right? Like John brought up the point of who is making the AI and who is consuming, the content, right? All of those folks have a shared stake in this. So that would, it's a tough conversation to facilitate, but I think, I'd err on the side of sort of values-based and inclusive in nature.
I've got a very tactical response to that, which is, I'll go back to the comment I made before. Politicians love shiny objects, right? They love to be able to attach to something that's new, important, etc. So the degree to which there's local innovation happening in the AI space, and making sure that is showcased and getting politicians in the loop in terms of local developments, local entrepreneurs, the incubator systems in local regional areas, and getting politicians excited about what's happening at a local level. I think that's at least one pathway to get this on the agenda and to make sure that, politicians basically are paying attention. They love the thing that is the latest thing and is having a local impact and can showcase local productivity and innovation. So the degree to which entrepreneurs and what have you are doing that, I think that's a good way to attach the policy machinery at a local level.
Definitely. So something that Mohammed brought up kind of in answering that question was, sort of the who's at the table and sometimes how that imbalance can be created, it's one of the big questions in international development in general. So another audience question is, what do you all think about the OECD's leadership of AI? And given that, the OECD is pretty much a global North organization. Most of the members are not from the global South. So, how do you deal with those potential imbalances where, maybe hostility could arise of saying, all these people are making these decisions or leading on this, how do we bring leadership from the global South to the table or, just support it further?
Yeah, so I love that question. And I couldn't agree more with the implication that the kind of global political infrastructure isn't very well suited for these kinds of conversations, right? You have places like the G20 that I think are trying to be more inclusive, right? And do represent something like 85% of the world's population. And I know the next presidency under Brazil, they've already stated that they intend to take put AI very high on the agenda, carrying on from India's leadership this year. And we're looking at the African Union perhaps becoming a standing member of the G20, which is really important. But at the end of the day, the G20 is not a rulemaking body, right? We don't have an effective rulemaking body to set standards for this, which is why I think you have organizations like the OECD coming in to fill some gaps. I don't know that I have a good answer for this, but my two instincts, and I'm not sure if these are contradictory in nature, but one is to go back to what Mohammed was saying earlier about values, because we are seeing a bifurcation of the digital world, and it's very much happening along values, right? So I think there are going to be different conversations happening in different political arena based on affinity of values and basic political philosophies, right? The other that is to think about, is there not more of a technocratic approach where you could perhaps get some basic agreement even at a global level, right? Where you take some of the political and even the economic competition aspects of how you govern AI globally. Can you put that aside the same way, central bankers by and large meet and agree on basic rules, right? Ian Bremmer suggested this, I think, a few days ago, where politics can be set aside, but you can at least take a no harm kind of baseline approach to what are common thresholds that we collectively as a society agree need to be respected.
I have a somewhat cynical view on this, having worked with the OECD and actually being married to somebody who worked for the OECD in a technology policy role for a long time. I don't think the OECD is going to have much that's very important to say on this. It's not that it's going to be very influential. I think this technology is moving too quickly. And I think one of the challenges, we haven't talked about policy and regulation. And, Mohammed and Kay have both mentioned the importance of safety, security, inclusiveness, what have you. I think one of the things we need to be very careful about is pre-regulating a technology that we don't really understand. And we actually don't have a clear trajectory on what the actual outcomes and implications and economic outcomes are going to be. I think my personal view is the EU jumped the gun on their AI regulations. Their regulatory framework has way too many constraints in it. They're actually going to disadvantage European players, and particularly European entrepreneurs who want to exploit this technology and build new tools. So I think policymakers, there needs to be an agreement on a framework around safety, inclusiveness, essentially all of those key values. But I think you need to be very careful about how quickly you go down the path of constraining, degrees of freedom in terms of how people exploit it. And that's particularly true in the global South, because the platforms are being developed in the North, and essentially giving entrepreneurs in the global South the freedom to basically take those platforms, experiment, bring new services to market, etc., will be critically important if they're going to end up innovating on those platforms as opposed to just being consumers of those platforms. So I think the pace of regulation and the caution around regulation, while recognizing the core values need to be there, I think is a really important thing. And maybe the OECD will have something to say about that, but I remain skeptical.
I think that's a really interesting point, that the precautionary principle can kind of end up turning on its head and kind of exacerbating those inequities with the global South. I think we might have time for we have time for one more question, maybe, where I'm hoping you kind of will all chime in. I'm kind of curious about whether ultimately, as a wrap up, overall, do you fall on the optimistic or pessimistic side of the spectrum about the impact of AI on jobs and skills and all the things we've talked about? Kind of where do you fall on its how it will impact the global South? Anyone can start. Jonathan, do you want to start us off?
Don't all speak at once.
Yeah,
and that's one of those deer in the headlight questions.
It's a big one. I get it, but
to be honest, I mean, if I'm just being direct and honest, I'm pessimistic. I think the pace of change, the potential level of dislocation, and the magnitude of the policy challenges that global South leaders will have to deal with are just overwhelming. If this technology continues on the trajectory that it's on, and we don't run into some, we could, in 3-4 years' time, run into some huge scaling barrier in these technologies and have to do a reset and all those sorts of things. But if they continue to develop at the rate they're changing, the ability, as we've talked about before, for these technologies to essentially automate a huge swathe of jobs that the global South economies have actually built growth on over the last 2 decades. We talked about India as an example. And I know India's put a lot of effort into transforming their digital services industries and what have you. But those major players in the IT sector in India, a large percentage of those jobs that are essentially basic coding and engineering jobs and infrastructure management jobs, they're just going to disappear because this technology has the potential to automate, essentially those jobs out of existence. And those are high paying, those are college level, education level jobs. And when we get into an environment where we're dislocating that level of society, you've got some real social challenges. And I know Mohammed said, working on the social safety net and what have you, those are big challenges for society. So I personally, I hate to be net negative, but I'm probably net negative in the long, over the midterm at least.
Okay, where do you fall?
So I'm trying very, very, very hard to remain optimistic, and I think just since Jonathan staked out ground in the glass half empty side of the spectrum, I will lean towards being cautiously optimistic, because I take all of the risks that Jonathan just listed to heart, and I think they're real. I also really doubt that AI is going to be that relevant to the way most global South economies work right now. But the potential upside, if you were to get AI right and have it be contextualized and accessible to all, the potential upside to really solving pretty quickly a lot of the basic problems that keep people impoverished, access to credit, access to good health care, that sort of thing. I do think that automation, if done well, has a lot of promise. That said, I'm hoping that the hype, both with the the folks that are looking at kind of utopian models as well as the dystopian futures, I hope that maybe that drives more attention to and more investment in closing these foundational gaps in the digital divide and the data divide that we opened up with, because that really will be the key to whether this works for all the world's poor or not.
I mean, that's a great point just about the potential. So Mohammed, to wrap up, where do you fall?
Yeah, it's both. I don't see it as a binary. We're going to see some pretty negative stuff. I think the displacement is going to be difficult. I think governments are not known for being nimble and able to respond quickly unless it's like a significant crisis. So I think we're going to have a tough time keeping up with the disruption. That's going to be very real. People are going to feel that. I will also say, I mean, I flagged earlier the piece about the disinformation and misinformation. The potential for that happening as a result of AI is very significant and really problematic. Deep fakes, all of that. I mean, we've seen a glimpse of that, and I think it's only going to continue to get worse as we see continued climate change, elections, heaven forbid, future pandemics. That is going to continue, and I think that's something to be mindful of, and is going to need folks to put their best thinking caps on and try to tackle those problems. On the flip side, I think there is a lot of opportunity around increased efficiency and a lot of things that will be automated. We'll be able to, folks will be able to work on different things. I think there's really an opportunity for educational institutions that are providing courses and opportunities to upskill. I think that's great. I think there's also a predictive nature of artificial intelligence that can be very helpful to predict where the next storm is going to hit, or where the next drought is going to take place, or where there's potential for some other crisis to to happen. I think that's really where the promise of AI is, and I think that's exciting to see. For me, it's a mixed bag, and I think we've just got to be eyes wide open about it. Look, 50, 60 years ago, when atomic energy was first coming online, this was a technology that had a lot of promise, but we also saw how it was used for a lot of destruction, and continues to be a threat, but also can provide clean energy to the world, right? So, as with any tool, we've got to use it for good.
Thanks for that. So I think it ends up with, one more negative, one cautiously optimistic, and someone right in the middle, which is just sort of, I think, exactly as the policy space falls. And I think that is all the time we have for today. So thank you to all our amazing panelists for joining us, and to everyone watching online. This is really just the tip of the iceberg on this issue, and there were so many different paths we can take in this conversation. So I hope you will join us for future discussions, and in the meantime, please reach out if you have any questions or comments on today's panel, and I look forward to staying in touch. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie.